happy to bring recording is in progress.
Sorry.
To bring forth a bunch of my colleagues and introduce you to some folks here in Nashville and beyond that that work in the water world, and more specifically work in the FEMA world, which is always this big thing that's out there and kind of nebulous in our discussions about what constitutes funding from FEMA, what are allocations, what's the hazard mitigation grant program, what are BRIC funds. And I always come with some garbled tidbit to our region meetings and try to get you to apply for funding, but they're going to tell you a lot more about how that can be done, how to do it advantageously, and a little bit of who to talk to in Tennessee about these topics. So I will introduce our three folks that we're going to have talk to you. I'll go alphabetically because why not? I'll go, the first is Christina Phillips, who's sitting across from me.
Hello.
We have a very fancy camera today as well. It's called the Owl. It features people as they speak. Christina Phillips has been with C.D. Smith for about 3 years now. She's a Clemson grad. She's a Clemson Tiger and does quite a bit of sewer modeling outside of the FEMA technical reviews and a bunch of stuff within the FEMA programs that we help administer. Next to her here in Nashville is David Jacobs, who is a UT Knoxville grad. David, you got what, like 8 years, 7-8 years with C.D. Smith now?
8.5 now, yeah.
Yep. So you do a bunch of HECRAS, you do water supply, and a ton of other water support in addition to being a National Technical Review member, pod lead, all kinds of different stuff. And our other colleague that is in, I guess in theory, quote unquote, Denver, you live at Estes Park, right, Erin?
That is Devin Schultze. I do live in Denver.
Oh, you live in Denver. Oh boy,
We're all learning things today. Yeah.
I've done it in Paris, but you are an SMU grad, and,
yes.
and you've been with CDM for 3 or 4 years, something like that.
Yeah, about 4 or 5.
4 or 5. Yeah, I know. I forget after it's been a few years too. You count the months, you count the years, and then you count the decades. But I'm going to get out of these 3 wonderful, knowledgeable folks' way and let them talk to you about the HMA grant program and how you can do your best to get funding, or at least navigate the process.
Yeah. Share my screen. Feel like it's best if you share first and then hit present, hopefully. All right. Okay, is this visible to the rest of the group? All right. Okay. Well, David, to kick us off.
All right, so I'll get started. Our presentation is called Increasing Resiliency Through FEMA HMA Grants. The outline of this presentation is why mitigation matters, the HMA grant program overview, certain eligibility requirements, considerations for utilities / MS4s, and additional resources for application development. And so why does this matter? Natural disasters are on the rise in Tennessee. Most of our disasters, a large percentage of them are floods or severe storms. So, recently as Waverly and not as far back, but, older, the 2010 Nashville floods. We have tornadoes and landslides. As climate change happens, we will be more susceptible to wildfires and extreme temperatures. We've already seen some wildfires out in the Smoky Mountain National Park, and as our wetter seasons become more wetter, leading to more severe floods, and drier seasons are drier, we may have an increased wildfire, extreme temperature, and droughts. So I know that we may not experience as much of those now, but this is disasters that we can help mitigate starting now, looking out into the future. The top 4 are definitely, the more common ones now. But again, we can think about out into the future to help build resiliency. So we know we need to address these issues, but how will we fund it? Which is great because that is what this presentation is all about. These funds are for eligible mitigation measures. So what do we want that to do? That reduces disaster losses and fosters resiliency. One of the main things we want to do as a part of this is break the cycle So historically, we have had disaster damage and then we reconstruct it, and then we have disaster damage again. And what we really want to do is build our infrastructure to maintain a higher level of protection, so that way we don't just continually have disaster damage. I know it's difficult with flooding because you are always susceptible to larger storm events, but throughout this program, we're hoping to help mitigate as much as we can. And a note for this is these funds we talk about in this presentation are not the only FEMA funds available. These are just one of the many pots of funding that is there for disaster mitigation and disaster assistance. And as part of the HMA grants program overview, there's 5 main programs. The 3 in the blue boxes are more only specific to Tennessee, but again, not necessarily required, or the only ones available. The first one is on the top left is the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, or HMGP. This is post-disaster. What that means is it's based on a presidential disaster declaration. So when the president says this was a disaster, FEMA is then authorized to release funds to the state to help fund any kind of mitigation. It doesn't have to be related specifically to that disaster. So if we think we have a drought project we would like to fund that is eligible under a HMGP grant, even if it was declared under a flooding event. To the top right is BRIC, or Building Resiliency Infrastructure Communities. And this is any eligible project type, and this is a non-disaster. So what that means is this is a part of a yearly review, and I believe the application period for that will open sometime in the fall. So BRIC is kind of an all-encompassing program which can have safe rooms, flooding, wildfire, earthquake, soil stabilization, or landslide prevention. And then the third, similar to BRIC, is a non-disaster for flood mitigation assistance, or FMA. And that it is for flood projects only, and it is for NFIP insured buildings, because that is typically the pot of money that funds those projects. So those are the requirements for that. And similar to BRIC, that is non-disaster, which means that the application period for that is a yearly application period. So you do not have to wait for a disaster to occur to try to get those FMA funds. Those are the 3, I'd say, higher priority grant programs that we would probably typically see in the state of Tennessee. The other 2 are the HMGP post-fire assistance. So this is post-wildfire, and it opens after state's first fire management assistance grant of the year. And the 5th one is pre-disaster mitigation, or PDM. This pot of money is specific congressional community projects, and it was replaced by BRIC. I believe I'll be passing it off to Erin.
Yeah, so let's look at an example of mitigation in action instead of just thinking about, kind of these high level administrative structures. So this is a project case study that FEMA has put out. It's in South Dakota, not Tennessee, but a lot of these issues are going to be similar across the country, right? So in this particular one in Lincoln County, there was a major flood event in 2010. It sparked a presidential disaster declaration, which means that they got HMGP, Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, funding available. And you can see the extent of that damage in the picture on the right. This whole road washed out. I'm sure, much larger impacts there. But even in the midst of that, even though this is a bad disaster, it opens up these funding opportunities, right? So through this, they were able to upsize their culverts at some railroad crossings, increase the flow capacity for the existing channels, and they were able to fund $1.8 million of their $2.4 million project through HMGP. So this was completed in 2017. So you will notice there, HMGP won't fund the entire project, and, the timelines are a little bit long. There's a lot of requirements that go into these grants, but also there is a lot of funding available. And so being able to think creatively about these before the disaster happens can be really helpful, so that when that funding becomes available, communities like Lincoln County or like you are able to take advantage of it. Okay, so we're going to look a little bit about take a step back and look at some of the eligibility requirements. Who can apply for these grants and what can you actually apply for? So first, just a little bit of terminology. First of all, we say that the applicant is the state. So for all of you, that would be Tennessee Emergency Management Agency. I assume that goes by TEMA. Again, I'm based out of Colorado. And so then everyone else applies underneath that as a sub-applicant, basically. So eligible sub-applicants is going to include state agencies, local governments, tribes, and sometimes nonprofits. And the key takeaway from this is that local governments has a really wide definition, which we included below from the HMA guidance. And basically what that means is that special districts or utilities, things like that, are able to apply as a sub-applicant. So presumably everyone on this call is going to be eligible, which is, a great place to start here. So there are a lot of project types that can be funded under mitigation because there are a lot of disasters, right? And a way to address those. So the way I like to think about all of these different project types is that there's ones that build capability and capacity within the community. There's ones that mitigate individual buildings. There's ones that reduce the hazard, so kind of preventing it from happening in the first place. And then there's ones that keep people safe. One kind of like general note is that some of these are only eligible under certain projects, or under certain programs. So the most obvious of that being that only flood adjacent projects can apply under FMA. So just keep that in mind when you're developing an application. And then also, if you have an idea that you think would reduce risk, but it's not quite fitting these categories, FEMA also has a general category for innovative projects. And so there may be some additional discussion there that could be possible for funding that project. Like I said, a lot of project types. We're not going to go through every single one here, but we kind of highlighted the ones that we think are most relevant to Tennessee and hopefully most relevant to utilities and MS4s as well. So the first one is project scoping and advanced assistance under building capacity and capability. So this is basically money that FEMA will give you to develop a project and eventually a sub-application. And so that can be really helpful if you're looking through this presentation and you're saying, hey, I know we have risk, but I don't know exactly where it is. I don't know which one of these is highest priority, or I don't have the technical documents that would be able to back this up to explain it to someone else. But in this case, a certain amount of money is set aside that is specifically for developing those projects. So that can be a really great place to start. The next one is for mitigating individual buildings. So thinking community-wide, a lot of times this is used for residential buildings, but for something like a utility or an MS4, this can be really helpful for something like maybe your administrative building, or maybe you have, a specific process or pump station that's hosted inside of a building. FEMA can do things like acquire it. So like a FEMA buyout, basically. You can elevate it, you can rebuild it stronger, you can drive flood-proof non-residential ones. Retrofit is kind of this like general category for making your infrastructure or building stronger against disasters. And then the last one on there is secondary power source. So generators is kind of the main thing there. There can also be a couple other types there like CHP or solar panels, but generators definitely helpful for utilities. So mark that one down. And then after that, we have ones that reduce hazards. So localized and non-localized flood risk reduction if you're in a flood-prone area. And stabilization, which is basically landslide. So maybe if you have a pipe that is experiencing a lot of erosion around it and you're worried about it breaking, that could be a really good example. And then finally, it is tornado country. So we also wanted to throw in that safe rooms are available or an eligible project type along with warning systems. Okay, so now maybe the less fun part, what isn't eligible? So we have a long list here, and FEMA actually has an even longer list in the HMA guidance. So we just tried to pull out the highlights on what we think are going to be relevant to the type of projects that MS4s would be interested in applying for. So just going through this list, the main one is going to be activities that don't reduce risk to people, structures, or infrastructure. So basically, there are a lot of good projects that your utilities are working on, but this one needs to be specific to mitigation and specifically mitigating physical property or protecting people. And like one thing to note on there too is that it should be primarily existing people and properties. So you know, FEMA doesn't want to be doing like capital improvements necessarily where they're paying for expansion of the system. It should be mitigating what's already there. And then any future buildings should already be built up to a code where they're preventing risk in the first place. So that's kind of the, you know, main starting point is just going back to, is it mitigation? After that, activities that are contingent on other work are not going to be eligible because FEMA wants to make sure that they're paying for a whole project that's actually going to reduce risk. So for example, if you're working on like a project that's maybe 3 or 4 phases and you just want FEMA to fund one of those, it's not going to work unless that phase in itself is reducing risk. Activities where physical work has already begun, that one's more straightforward. There just can't be groundbreaking already. Deferred maintenance is going to mean that, again, it has to actually like increase your resiliency to a disaster. So it can't just be, oh, like our pipes are really stuck full of debris because we haven't cleaned out in a long time and that's reducing the its capacity, things like that. Or maybe like we haven't maintained this pump as well as we should be. That's not going to fly. It has to actually increase the system's resilience. So you need to show that, you know, we're not just replacing the pipe to the same level, we're actually like increasing its size so it can carry more flood water in that sort of example, but apply more widely. Next one we'll go into in a little more detail because it's nuanced, but it can't just be for water quality improvements, but it can be for mitigating water quality infrastructure. So we'll go into that. Similarly to that, it can't just address ecological or agricultural issues, so can't just be an irrigation project, basically. And then under HMA, FEMA cannot fund preparedness and response measures and equipment. So backup supplies, things like that, or maybe sometimes people will want sandbags that they can put out during a flood. That's not going to work because FEMA wants to make sure that this is actually going to be mitigating this disaster and not require that additional human intervention. So again, not the full comprehensive list, but just kind of to set some expectations there on eligibility. Okay, so now we're gonna just again give a little more nuance to that conversation about water quality improvements versus mitigating water quality infrastructure. So water quality improvements could involve types of projects where like we're going to protect our source water. Maybe we're going to prevent a wildfire from ruining it, and we're going to save a ton of money on treatment. Or maybe, hey, if it floods, we're going to have to spill all of our wastewater into a river, and it's going to be really bad for the river. Those are definitely good projects. You should definitely do that, you know, pro-environment, but it's not mitigating specific people, property, or infrastructure. So in that case, it's going to be not eligible. The water quality infrastructure, on the other hand, if you're showing those specific impacts, so maybe you're saying this project will prevent boil water notices or no flush orders, or this project is going to make sure our pipes don't break in a landslide as it keeps eroding, or this project's going to reduce flooding at our administrative building. Those are all going to be eligible because they're showing the specific impacts to people, property, infrastructure, to keep repeating myself. However, this is also a really good opportunity to start thinking through some of those partnerships that exist within your community. So to go back to the example about, you know, maybe a wildfire affecting the watershed, that's something really big out by me. Maybe that same wildfire would also be at risk to roads or the power utility or houses. You know, these are really wide-reaching events. And so it might not be the primary benefit in that case, but you could work with other communities or other groups within your community to start thinking through some of those wider impacts. And maybe they're pitching it as, you know, this project is going to save all these houses, but then you as an MS4 are also going to get that benefit of protecting source water. So again, you know, we want to keep these guidelines in mind, but be able to be creative with them and thinking through some of these ways that we can team across our communities to build more resilience overall. All right, and then just a few more eligibility requirements, just so we're not, you know, making this sound easier than it is, basically. The first one is that your community has to have a hazard mitigation plan. That's not something that would be on the utility to write or implement, but it's something that you should check is available because that can be an issue. Feasibility and effectiveness is going to be proving that this solution is actually going to reduce risk and reduce the hazard. So it's not just showing that it can be built, but actually showing that it's going to help. Environmental and historic preservation requirements. Again, this is kind of like a wider federal requirement, but basically that, you know, you're not going to like destroy an endangered species while you're trying to build your project, things like that. Cost share, like we mentioned in our initial example, FEMA will typically pay up to 75% of your project cost for these grants. So you will need to document that you're able to pay the other 25% or how you're going to pay that. Administrative requirements, bunch of forms, super fun if you like forms. And then duplication of benefits is going to be things like making sure this project isn't double funded. So for example, maybe if the Army Corps is also addressing flooding in this area, showing that FEMA isn't paying for the same thing as them, because that's not helping anyone. Okay, and then the final one is cost effectiveness. So filling out a benefit cost analysis. There are some efficiencies and some ways of making that easier, but in general, that is often the most difficult part of a sub-application. And sometimes people who are new to these grants will underestimate that. So we're not going into that in a lot of detail on this presentation, but really just wanted to pitch to be taking that seriously and be taking that into account and talk to your state hazard mitigation officer as you're developing your project.
Alrighty, so I'm gonna jump in now and talk about some specific things to Tennessee, some specific considerations for MS4s, and kind of next steps and what does this look like to get started. So we've kind of highlighted a little bit of this before, but the main funding that's available in Tennessee is going to be those two annual programs, the BRIC and FMA programs, and that next round funding cycle will the application will open up in the fall. And then on top of that, we also have this list here of open disasters, and I will give the disclosure that I don't know how allocated these are, so that's something to talk to your state hazard mitigation officer about. But each one of these disasters has an associated HMGP funding pot with it, and I mean, you probably see these and recognize and remember them. I mean, that photo on the bottom right is from that March 2023 storm. So it's just, making that connection that anytime you have one of those events and you notice that presidential disaster declaration, it's a good time to check and see, oh, are there now additional HMGP funds available? Because even if that disaster didn't impact, your specific community, like those funds are available for the entire state. So that's a great opportunity to talk to your state hazard mitigation officer. Yeah, and so just keep that in mind as the future rolls on. And then also just wanted to highlight, this is from a, I guess, FEMA kind of hazard mitigation assistance report from 2021. And there are similar graphics for the other grant programs, but as you can see here, Tennessee is kind of on the lower end of submitted application dollars. So there's definitely room for growth, and room to capitalize on these funds that are available. And this this same trend is of Tennessee kind of being on the lower end is present for the other programs as well, HMGP and BRIC. So there's definitely, room to, put together more applications and promote mitigation in Tennessee. All right. So now some specific considerations for utilities, MS4s. I mostly just put these are just some questions to help you start thinking over, how can I apply this? What does this mean for me? So one of the first things to start with would be project scoping, thinking through, what parts of my facilities or my infrastructure are most at risk. And I think, as Erin kind of highlighted earlier, it's, important to think about how that infrastructure also interacts with all of the other components of the community, because, with stormwater infrastructure, whether or not that is functioning has a direct impact on, people's daily lives and buildings, roads, everything that goes on in the community. So thinking about how all of those pieces tie together, and, when you're having a disaster event, what could go wrong? Where could you see damages? And then from there, you can move to starting to gather some of that information that you would need to put together an application. So thinking about, what are the options we could do to mitigate this problem? If you have issues with flooding, there are a lot of different ways to address it. From something like, upsizing culverts that was highlighted in that, project case study back at the beginning. That same community could have also taken an approach of acquiring some of those buildings. So, sometimes that's a conversation that needs to be had between, what alternatives are available, what's the community interested in, what's the best fit. And then I think also this is a really good point to start thinking about, what are the impacts? What's the potential for actual, reduction in risk and reduction in future damages? Because as we've kind of pounded home throughout this entire presentation, the HMA funds have to go to projects that are going to mitigate risk to infrastructure, property, or keeping people safe. So thinking about, if we do this project, what is the real impact going to be? And I would say this also can be really helpful when you start moving into the BCA phase, because that's what is going to be captured in that benefit cost analysis, is thinking about, are the future damages that we are avoiding by implementing this project going to outweigh the cost to, build it in the first place? So starting to think through and catalog some of those impacts is a great, first way to start getting an idea for, okay, is this going to be a cost-effective project? Is this going to be a good investment, both of our, local share of that cost share and of FEMA's money? And then, as we've already mentioned, I think this is also a great opportunity to explore partnerships. And this could even just be with your counterparts in other departments at, your town or city, and thinking about, who else should be involved. Because oftentimes, these projects can have wide-reaching impacts across, different sectors. And so, thinking about, how can we have a project that can, address risk to multiple different types of infrastructure can be really, really valuable. And then also keeping in mind that this will have to be maintained long term, and planning for that, as you prepare your application. And so these are some kind of next steps, and they're not really in a specific order. But one of the key elements that would be kind of the go, no go for, developing an application would be getting that scope of work nailed down, determining, all of the specific steps that will be required to implement the project, and how long it will take and how much it will cost. FEMA typically requires a implementation period of 36 months. So it's good to kind of keep that in mind, that, you know, from the date of award to, you know, project closeout, that's the typical time frame. And then to also start thinking about, okay, to support this scope of work, what documents do I need? And I'll highlight here, I think one of the things that we will see most often for flood projects, which would be some form of H&H study, because this can take a little bit of work, but it's going to be one of the most valuable documents to help demonstrate, you know, if I build this project, you know, am I going to mitigate risk? You know, what's going to be the reduction in my flood elevations? How many houses am I, or how many structures or roads or pipes am I going to be able to protect? And so having that, you know, piece of documentation can be really, really valuable, both for demonstrating, you know, on the technical feasibility side that you are mitigating risk, and on the cost effectiveness side that, you know, in the long term, you are going to be saving money. And so from here, it's a good point to think also about, you know, which program is best. We only touched on a little bit of this at the beginning, but, you know, each one of these programs has, you know, some of its own specific requirements, and some projects, you know, are only eligible under a certain program. So it's good to start thinking about, you know, which program is the best fit for your community or your project. And these are all the types of questions that would be really good to take to your state hazard mitigation officer. So I've got his contact information on the next slide, and that will be Douglas Warden. And so that is who, you know, we would recommend reaching out to as you start this project. Coordinate with him, you know, throughout your process, keep informed. But he's going to be a great resource to, you know, help walk you through, you know, if you have additional questions about whether or not your project is eligible, if you have questions, you know, about, has this been done before? He's going to have, you know, visibility on what sorts of projects have been submitted and funded in the past, and have a lot of valuable knowledge to share. So that is a really great place to start. And then we also have some resources here. I'm going to come to those in a second, but before I jump to that, I want to kind of back up and I guess go back to something we brought up at the beginning, because I know that like this is a lot of information. There are a lot of steps, and you know, sometimes you don't have the resources to move these projects forward. So if this is feeling very overwhelming, FEMA has started to put together some opportunities to provide assistance on that front. And one of those we highlighted earlier, which is project scoping. So that's, you know, funds that are available specifically to help you develop projects, to help you study your risk and evaluate different alternatives and identify the best options. So those are funds that are available. In addition to that, the BRIC program has recently started an offering of non-financial technical assistance. So in addition to their financial grants that can be applied for, now communities can also apply to receive technical assistance to help them develop applications, where FEMA will work directly with the community to help them, you know, understand their risk, to help them put together an application and figure out which projects are going to have the most impact for their community. So, and those are just two examples, but there are a lot of new resources available to really help you get started. It's like, we recognize that there are a lot of steps and it can be a little bit overwhelming, but there are definitely a lot of good resources to look into. And so with that, also wanted to just take a second and highlight some of the, I guess, actual materials that are available. And so Aaron was going to show a couple of those actually in the FEMA website to just show you where those are if you are interested in learning more or getting a little bit more information on, you know, whether a certain project where it might fit. So I think I can see her screen, so hopefully everybody else can, and I'll pass it over to her.
Sweet. Yeah. So I'll put these sorry, not these chats in the link, these links in the chat as well. But just these were a couple that were mentioned on that last slide, and just to show you how to navigate this. So this one is the application support material it's for HMGP. Honestly, it applies more widely than that. It'll still kind of give you tips and tricks, and it's basically a checklist for filling out a sub-application, which is very useful because every state does HMGP a little bit differently, so it can be a little confusing. So basically, when you're going down here, if you have a specific project type in mind, say I want to look at flood risk reduction, since that's a lot of what we've been talking about, you can select it, you can search your media, and then you'll see we have a lot of documents even just for flood risk. So we're going to have some information specific to EHP. We're going to have instructions, an overview, and then this application example document is the one that's basically going to be a checklist. So this one will be really helpful. You can start thinking through what, specific information you're going to need just administratively. But then it's also going to go through a lot of this, like, how do I actually write up a project narrative in a way that's going to be clear to FEMA and address their concerns? What are some of these EHP concerns? So again, this is just an example, basically. But especially if you're at a starting point, you're not sure exactly what program you're going to be applying under, this will be a really great place to start thinking through all of that. And again, we have that for 13 different project types now, so that should be enough to get you started. And then you can go through and kind of read up more on what type of information would be required. And then our next one, I like to pitch this as, if you are loving this talk and you wish you could read 600 more pages about HMA, boy, do I have a new document for you. It is the HMA Program and Policy Guide. So this was very recently released or just updated. And we're obviously not going to go through this thing, but just want to show you guys that if you're looking for more details, you're going through and you're like, I'm actually not completely sure about the eligibility requirements. It's pretty easy to navigate through here. So like we have the whole eligibility section, and then there's a whole part that just goes project type by project type through what specific things you're going to need to provide for that, what makes it eligible, what doesn't. There's a whole section on the BCA on cost effectiveness. So if you want a little bit more detail, or if you're not sure, again, your state hazard mitigation officer can be a good person as well, but this is really going to be a great resource to start with. That's going to go through a little more detail. So again, I'll go ahead and put those in the chat. But just to wrap us up before we get to questions, I mean, as noted, like none of us work for FEMA. We're not here because we want you to apply for our grant program. We just truly believe that, resiliency is important and mitigation is important, and we want all of these utilities in the communities where we live to have the opportunity to really invest in our future. I know these grants can sometimes be intimidating to people, but there really is so much funding available, and FEMA really does want to help you get through this process and, all achieve better communities together. So just kind of wanted to end with that general pitch. But then, yeah, if there's any questions, you're welcome to come off mute, or I'm not seeing any in the chat right now, but welcome to put them there.
I have a couple of tidbits to chime in regarding Tennessee and everything else that's gone on the past couple of years around this topic. Is that there was Senate Bill 2525 last year, and its accompanying House bill, which sought to establish the Tennessee Flood Resilience and Community Preparedness Task Force. That was spiked in committees, and it didn't happen. So the signaling on the state level, at least in Aaron Rogge's opinion, is that we're kind of on our own as communities, MS4s, to try to attack and get this funding. And there probably is not going to be an additional office that represents us and does a good job of preparing your sub-applications beyond what TEMA does. At least not right now. I haven't heard any more about that bill this year. If somebody else knows about that sort of bill, I'd love to hear more about it, but after last April, when it got spiked, I heard it fall apart. And you know, these risks aren't going away. It's just that, in many of our cases, we simply don't know about them yet. You know, there was a mention of the H&H studies, and the ability to even map in our communities where we have the most risk is often where most of us are sitting right now. And it's an effort of coordinating your public works and your engineering and your stormwater utility and all these different pieces to try to come together and form a cohesive map of the risk in your community before embarking on this sort of thing. But there's a question.
Yes, somebody is asking on the map slide whether or not it was the submitted or the, I guess, like awarded funds. And if I'm reading that correctly, it looks like, let's see.
I think it was obligated.
Maybe it is.
I'm gonna also drop a link there.
We can share the link to that document specifically because it has the associated, I guess, other figures and all of the information that went into creating those. So yeah, this one looks like it was funds that have been obligated since the program's inception. But there are similar graphs just for the, I guess, the 2021 funding for FMA, for the HMGP funding that's available. So there's a lot of useful information in there.
And to kind of build on that in terms of the different funding, if you have a project that is eligible for both FMA and BRIC, you can submit under both programs in the yearly application period. If you are approved and selected and obligated, you will only receive it under one of those programs. I can't tell you exactly which one, that is not up to us, but that is an option if you're not sure. Not to say it helps your odds, but it is there. And additionally, a lot of the programs tend to have very similar requirements. So as long as you meet all of them, let's say you submit under a BRIC and you are not selected, but then an HMGP disaster happens or HMGP funds are released, you are also allowed to, not to say reuse, but tailor that application under HMGP. So if you submit under BRIC and are not selected, that doesn't mean necessarily that it is a bad project or it won't ever get funded. It's just FMA and BRIC are competitive grants. So there is that level of scrutiny when it is reviewed.
Yeah, and on that front too, that's one of the nice things about HMGP is it's actually a non-competitive program. So you're not competing against everybody else in the country when you submit an HMGP project.
Could you talk a little more about, and I don't know if this is going to be relevant to everybody in the call, but EDRC or economically disadvantaged rural communities, there's some sort of special accommodation for those, right?
There are a couple of different, I think, things available, and it kind of depends on, I guess, the specific notice of funding opportunity, the NOFO for each period. So I would check the upcoming NOFO for the 2023 BRIC funds to see what's specifically in there. But historically, there have been some differences in the cost share requirements for EDRCs. So I think that FEMA has allowed a up to 90% cost share for EDRCs in the past. But yeah, I would definitely be checking that NOFO document to see what they do for the next cycle.
Yeah, and there's also been some, oh, sorry, no, you're good. I was gonna say there was some this year where certain communities would qualify to have their BCA done for them under BRIC and FMA. So that's also a bit, that can relieve a lot of burden. So that's definitely why, again, maybe we can put the SHMO's contact information in the chat too, because they're gonna be like the most knowledgeable on like what specifically is going on at the time and what's available in Tennessee. Can talk through some of those ways to ease that burden.
And what I was thinking about as we're talking about matching funds, that, 75%, if you will, of the funds will be matched. So your 25% of that money, it could be millions of dollars. What sorts of funding sources would you commonly see as proof? Is it like a dedicated stormwater utility fee or state revolving funds, bonds? What sort of things outside of just a general fund? Because that's probably a tougher sell, is like, we just have a dedicated revenue stream that we're competing with our fire department for. Do you see state revolving funds and other funding sources as a possibility for those?
I feel like there are lots of options for non-federal cost share, and maybe, I know we're just like spitting documents at you, but I know I can add the FEMA document on cost share and non-federal cost share options, because there are a lot of options. There are some unique options as well. But yeah, I feel like those are the types of things that we'll see. I mean, if you have a project that's like a smaller scale, like, an acquisition or elevation, sometimes the homeowner is even involved in the non-federal share. But there are a lot of options. So I definitely would not be able to name them all off the top of my head. But I can find that document and stick it in the chat.
And there is also a section on cost share in the HMA guidance. It's, from what I'm looking at, it's not like as specific as I think the one Christina is going to pull up. But again, if you're looking for just, one document that's going to have most of it, that also goes through some of those cost share quirks, like when, FEMA can pay more than 75%.
All right, do we have any other questions? And open floor for anybody else. I know this always seems like such a big thing that is out there, but you're up against, and FEMA wants people to apply. There's money that, often is out there, and, is the clock is ticking on it to get spent, but they simultaneously can't necessarily tell you exactly what to do. Like, we can't exactly tell you what to do as for your particular project, but the guidance documents are evolving. As you saw, there was one from just last month.
I have to run to another meeting, but this was so good. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you. Thanks for joining.
Thank you all for participating today. Are there any other questions, last minute thoughts, anything else left? Well, I want to remind you all that I do record these, and they will